Exodus 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labour in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labour the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you're helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." We're looking today at Exodus 1, and I guess the first thing to say is that in the very first verse you're left with an assumption that there's a story that leads up to this one. How did we get here? A story you'll find if you read chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis, where you'll find Joseph's story. That in turn will lead you further back to work out why Jacob and his family have the role they have in the history of the people of God. Suffice it to say, this family are bearers of God's promise, which is to be fruitful and to bless all the peoples of the earth. And we've landed midway in the story of their lineage and their fulfilling of that destiny. And we need to understand that backstory to understand what's unfolding here. I wish we had time to fully unpack it, but the condensed version is that through God's grace, Joseph, Jacob's son, is enabled by God to foresee a great famine that will face Egypt. And Pharaoh, recognizing this, has elevated him into power over the people of Egypt. In preparation, he's taxed the population. He gathers a portion of their harvest, so when the famine hits, he's able to feed and support them. So far, so good. The twist in the tale is that Joseph doesn't freely distribute this food, but rather sells it back to the Egyptians. And worse, when they run out of money, they're then forced to sell their land and eventually even themselves into servitude to Pharaoh. For Pharaoh, it's a win. He accrues wealth, he accrues absolute power. For the Egyptians, they become a people enslaved to Pharaoh, and Joseph is the face of that. Worse still, Joseph's family, through Pharaoh's benevolence, were given good land, which presumably was more resistant to famine, and I suspect they didn't have the indignity of grovelling for food as they did. Just imagine a scenario today where you were ruled by a super wealthy elite, and yet you find yourself struggling to make ends meet, when each of the ruling elite's decisions, rather than liberating you, seems to further mar you in challenge. It's no surprise, is it, that injustice simmers below the surface of this story. And chapter 12 of Exodus tells us the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. And so in chapter 1 we potentially have several centuries unfolding. The events are told as if they're over a matter of weeks, but they could easily have been decades. Clearly a new Pharaoh's in town, and driven by fear and falling perhaps into patterns which he himself experienced and suffered under Joseph, turns the tables on the people of Israel. The nation that through Joseph enslaved the Egyptians themselves become slaves. Clearly this endured for many years. They're described as building store cities. That's not something that happens overnight. And so the enmity, but eventually the enmity and ill treatment grows, and they're worked ever more harshly, more bricks, less help. And then the coup de grace, population control of the worst kind. I hope it's anecdotal, but there's an urban myth that if you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. If you put it in tepid water and slowly heat it, the frog will remain in it until it boils to death. It's a metaphor, isn't it? A metaphor for us, perhaps, for those who would wound us, those who would seek to hurt us by 1,000 cuts, another saying. Creeping taxation, laws that subtly erode our freedoms or empower the malevolent. It seems to me for the majority of the Israelites, they simply endured each of these challenges and changes. They too became utterly trapped in the oppression, so much so they never even considered rising up. Moses, our hero, is about to be born if we continued in Exodus, but I want to mark the gentle heroism and more subtle resistance of our midwives Shiphrah and Puah, a powerful model and reminder of different ways to resist oppression. There are all sorts of ideas, all sorts of stories we could explore here already, each worthy of their own reflection. But for now, I want us to think about how change happens. There's a build-up to the events that are about to take place, which have unfolded over many, many years. But suddenly something shifts, which makes a difference. And just a few individuals are being used to bring about a change that is so significant, it becomes foundational in the life of the people of God from this point on. But as we listen to their story unfold, we need to be aware that though we have a collective name for this people, the Hebrews, outsiders, Israelites, as a people, it doesn't necessarily mean they were all responding uniformly to what was happening to them. It's a dangerous thing to do that, to generalize. And part of the reason this change in Exodus resonates for me is reflecting on the evolution of Christianity at the moment. And in particular because over Sabbatical I read a book by a lady called Phyllis Tickle. It was published over a decade ago and I finally had a chance to read it. She was actually by background a book editor, and in reading the many books that were pouring forth in spirituality and church over the last several years, it led her to see a pattern and report her findings. What she reported in her book was a 500-year cycle in the life of the Christian faith. Not that different then to this kind of 430 years plus that we've been looking at in Exodus. Her key observation looking at this history is that we're in the middle of such an upheaval now. She's entitled this the Great Emergence. And just briefly to offer background to her claim, and winding back from now 500 years, she cites the previous upset was the Reformation, fueled by the ideas of people like Luther, Wycliffe, Munzer, Knox, Calvin and Hooker, energized by the technology of the printing press. We saw through what went on there the emergence of Protestantism in all, as Phyllis says, its shredding divisiveness and gifts. I don't know whether we would own that description of ourselves, but there's certainly a lot of denominations and ways of being church, isn't there? 500 years before that was the Great Schism that saw Eastern Orthodox and Latin churches part their ways. Before that, there was Gregory the Great, who alongside the synods that dealt with doctrinal differences on the nature of Jesus' divinity, encouraged the monastic movements into being, which sheltered and allowed the church to continue to develop through the Dark Ages. No prizes for guessing who caused the disruption 500 years before that. We're in the 1st century. For us, Jesus' life was foundational. For the Jewish church, it's worth kind of reminding ourselves that it was an enormous challenge to their status quo. It threatened who they were, what they were, how they did things. What I hadn't realised until I journeyed through Greece in Paul's footsteps recently was that there was a similarly long pattern of spiritual, physical and cultural turmoil and associated spiritual growth that prepared the ground for Jesus and those who followed him themselves. The real positive aspect of what Phyllis recognised was that although tumultuous, each period of upset led to new streams of church, of thought, and generally an increasing reach of the Christian faith. Overall, there was blessings from the chaos. As she said here, we need to gauge our pain against the patterns and gains of each of the previous hinge times. Christian faith has ever been destroyed, but never been, I should say, by one of our semi-millennial interruptions. Instead, each simply lost their hegemony or their pride of place to the new and not yet organised form that was being birthed. Phyllis likens each emergent 500-year phase to a rummage sale from which this new depth and breadth of life emerges, but new streams are created. In a book, she spends quite some time unpacking the events that led up to the Reformation by way of example, and then she moves on to spell out what she sees as contributing to the Great Emergence of which we are now part of. I'm not going to go into that to some extent because whenever we reflect or analyse on our lives as church, we quite easily identify huge changes of culture, technology and patterns of life that have fueled what we've seen as a decline in church membership in recent decades. What I was more interested in sharing with you are her observations on how this has and is continuing to impact on those who continue to be Christians, how our faith practices have evolved and how they continue to evolve. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is, I suppose, to challenge the idea that as people of faith, as Christians today, we're each in the same place in this evolution and on our own pilgrim journey. It doesn't mean we can't find common ground, common purpose, common identity, belonging and meaning, but it may help explain when sometimes we feel on the edge. Now, I like graphics, and Phyllis uses the following diagram, and I found this helpful to explain what she's talking about. Phyllis, she's quite keen to point out that the ideas she sets out here neither wholly define or explain, but just help us grasp broad patterns of behaviour. And with her help, we're going to walk through a rough evolution of churches from the 1960s to today. And she's categorised Christians according to four main leanings: liturgicals, social justice Christians, renewalists and conservatives. For liturgicals are those who use a lot of set text, creative writing that's passed down and tested and weighed. Roman Catholics, Church of England, very much use liturgy, and so there's liturgicals. The social justice Christians are those who seek to enact their faith by trying to make the world a better place, and that's a priority for them, and the Methodist Church has traditionally sat in that quadrant. The renewalists encompasses the charismatic renewal, the Pentecostal churches, Assemblies of God, people like that, those who look to the Spirit and have a focus on the Spirit's work and life and internal transformation. And then the conservatives is at the time her latest way of encompassing those who might have been called fundamentalists, evangelical, theocrats, Southern Baptists. A lot of American churches fall into this guise, and a lot of UK churches too. There are some churches excluded by this, the Quakers among them. No model is perfect, and there's reasons for that. In recent decades, though, she charts that people have felt liberated, encouraged even to leave their tight denominational belonging and experience and dip in and out of the practices and spiritualities offered by others. So there's these petals, these represent overlaps between the quadrants, and each quadrant overlaps with each other. So New Wine, which I've attended, is a charismatic stream of the Church of England. Similarly, much more evangelical than many Church of England churches. For us Methodists, we have the charismatic and evangelical places such as Spring Harvest, Easter People, or we may have spent time in more liturgical spaces. We may have done services with the Anglicans, or we may have gone somewhere like Ampleforth for retreats. There is a logic to Phyllis's quadrants, which of course in reality are a spectrum. The way she's demarcated these quadrants is that the top half is in general more concerned with doing the right thing, orthopraxy, and the lower half believing the right thing, orthodoxy. Both do both, but the orthopraxy is more likely to help prioritize working faith out, i.e. helping the poor, over attending worship. The lower half are more likely to see worship as a priority that leads to such action. It's not that one does and the other doesn't. And so you find in our churches people with all sorts of experiences and priorities. Towards the end of the century, it became more and more extreme, this mixing, and included other things like meditation, like yoga, like other Eastern church practices. And to a large extent, many Christians, through this mixing, through this exploring of the different quadrants, have ceased to feel they really belong to traditional churches altogether, and they draw on now a much wider range of spiritual approaches, whether they be in fresh expressions or things that are nothing like church as we would recognise them. And that's the rose at the centre of the diagram now, this swirling mass, a rummage sale in the centre. Phyllis believes that over 60% of those who follow Jesus will end up in this swirling, emerging church. For 10%, though, the response to this emerging way of doing church is to retreat as much as possible into their siloed corners and try and undo what they see as an erosion of faith and the changes that have been occurring of late. 30% that leaves, if my maths is right, that are neither reacting, going into a corner, or emerging in this swirling morass. And again, there's a spectrum of response. And Phyllis tries to capture this with these dotted circles. The traditionalists is the outer circle closest to the kind of corners. And they've chosen to stay. They like church as is, and they don't want to change anything. But they aren't actively opposed to change, and so allow others around them among their number to happily explore it. And Phyllis uses a metaphor of inheriting Grandad's house. And these people might be those who love the house so much they simply move in as is without even changing the decor. The re-traditionalists, which is the next layer in, have chosen to stay again in the inherited church, in the church as we've known it, but want to recover what it used to be. And so they look for ways to polish it, to improve it, to recover the patterns that were life-giving. In Grandad's house, this is equivalent to leaving much of the decor and furniture, but upgrading the plumbing, upgrading the electrics, putting in a fresh kitchen so it's good to serve a new century and way of life. The progressive Christians is another circle nearer the rummage centre, and these people really struggle with the skeleton of church, its institution, what they see as dogma and doctrinal inflexibility. These guys would take Grandad's house, they would replace the windows, they would knock down the porch, they would take out some interior walls and reshape the inside so it could enable new ways of living, new activity and use. And then closer still, we have the hyphenated, who are so loosely blown into the home quadrants they feel really able to bridge to this emerging centre. In our metaphor, they go as far as knocking down Grandad's house entirely, but they keep the land and then they sift through the wreckage for the odd treasure, the odd architectural detail, so they can form a new sort of house. And they're not beyond going and looking around the other wrecked houses too. So these Phyllis entitles meth emergent individuals or churches, or cath emergent, depending on your starting place. Some of these categories may speak to where you are at. Or it could be, despite the fact that you're listening to this, that you actually see yourself already in that swirling, emerging centre. For my next slide. So what do we know about that centre? What do we know about what is shaping up what was Phyllis seeing a decade ago? What we do know is that other measures and values are at play to the traditional corners and to that orthopraxy and orthodoxy. We add into the mix two new terms that I'm still getting my head round: orthonomy and theonomy. Orthonomy values what's beautiful and harmonious in order to discern truth. Theonomy is about recognizing God as a source of beauty and truth. And so if we think about people in champion the environment, I can well imagine in their hearts they aspire to a kingdom like that in Revelation, where the lion and lamb lay down, everybody lives in harmony, where we're looking after the planet and the planet's looking after us, that sort of beautiful harmony and a oneness with nature. Others will look to God to guide and see the beauty of God in helping us to get to that place, perhaps. And quite clearly, the new emerging church won't have the same sort of structural hierarchy we're used to. It'll be more like a network or an ecosystem, or even maybe an organism is a better way of describing how it might work. So much more the body of Christ than what the church has become, with bishops and archbishops and ministers and people in charge. Each person finding their place, finding their value within the organism. Each person holding part of the story, the good news, and enabling part of the kingdom to be lived in an everyday reality. And this new emerging church will be centered rather than bounded. So think wells in the desert rather than stone walls keeping the sheep in. And belonging that leads to believing rather than some sort of measure of belief by which we then welcomed into the family of God that must exist before embraced as people of faith or people who we will journey with. Finally, the claims, I think, for any church, any denomination having all the answers and a grand narrative, clearly at the moment are pretty distrusted. It's pretty true of most institutions at the minute. And yet, there's ever more value in the stories we tell and share. They are more important. Maybe your head is now spinning. I've been living and breathing this stuff for over a decade at least. And the Kairos movement draws and lives out and tries to explore some of the ideas that Phyllis identified. I think my point is, being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, is not actually that easy to define. Most of us at some level are emerging or evolving just as much as the culture transforms around us. And maybe that frightens us. And maybe you've left churches that have felt constraining or limiting and you feel bad about that. I wrestle with it myself, but I believe what Phyllis is showing us, and I believe has a great deal of truth to it, is that it's not just things are falling apart, but our faith is shifting. And it is doing so because Christianity is having a growth spurt. My son Thomas used to hate growing pains, but of late years he now rejoices in them because he knows it means he is growing. And this summer he became taller than his dad, and he is thrilled, and honestly I am thrilled for him. Wherever you are in this process, there are growing pains. It may not be easy, but there are others at the same point who might value you as a journey companion. We won't all respond the same. We won't all evolve at the same rate. We won't even all change. But the good news is, I believe, we are all part of God's future for his church and for the kingdom that is being revealed and that we will bring with his love and power. Amen.